Hi there, and welcome to my talk on exploring accessible player experiences with Diary Methods. My name is Joseph Kulik, and this talk is for Game Accessibility Conference 2023. Just to provide a little about myself, I am a PhD student at the University of York that is focused on understanding experiences, challenges, and barriers towards making accessible games. Much of my research has been focused on interviewing game developers, as well as interviewing people with disabilities about their experiences. Previously, I was working in the games industry as a games user researcher at a company called Player Research. I was working first in Brighton, then in Montreal, and I've worked on games like Life is Strange 2, FIFA, and Surviving Mars. I also have an education in psychology, which kind of led me to the user research work that I was doing originally as well. So, just to provide a few highlights, this talk should provide you with some understanding of the value of diary methods and more natural investigations of the player experience. It should also demonstrate the value of retrospective analysis. So a lot of developers are kind of looking forward quite frequently, where you're kind of like running user research in parallel with the game you're developing. But the argument here is that there is actually a lot of value behind you as well. And then this type of analysis, this type of retrospective work, especially in an area like game accessibility, where a lot of developers don't really know how their game was being experienced in the past by people with disabilities. I think there's a lot of value for this kind of work in that area as well. We're talking about how players with disabilities experience games and how accessibility barriers affect their experience. And in line with that as well, we're talking about kind of why players sometimes continue and adapt, but other times seem to cease play. And then we'll also be talking about the implications that these kind of findings might have on how games are designed and how we can avoid misaligned player experiences. And that might not make sense at this point, but I'll talk about it in more detail later. So, starting off with motivations. So, in terms of the state of accessibility work in the industry, I think it's fair to say that there has been a considerable drive in the last 5 or so years towards making more accessible games. I think we have, especially at the games that seem very focused on accessibility, The Last of Us Part 2 and games made by Ubisoft and Microsoft and all these big companies working towards making more accessible games. There are lots of standout titles that feature a ton of accessibility features that weren't present before. And equally, we have a lot more of a kind of like a physical accessibility push from the console manufacturers, with 2 or 3 of the leading console manufacturers now offering some form of adaptive controller. And as well as that, we also have a lot more accessibility hiring occurring now too. I'm not sure on the exact numbers of this, but someone mentioned it to me before, where there are many studios who are just starting to hire a single person who has a dedicated focus on kind of game accessibility within these studios, which I think is great. However, I also think that we're still not there yet, and that there are a number of issues that still remain. We still have a lot of games being released that seem to have very little focus on game accessibility, or we have games that have some focus but still have major accessibility issues in certain areas and things like that as well. So, in terms of the kind of state of accessibility research, much of the research thus far has focused on providing design solutions to accessibility problems. Things like designing universally accessible games. There are a number of papers that demonstrate kind of how you might design something like universally accessible chess, or things like a racing game and things like that, which are very interesting. There are also a lot of guidelines. There's obviously the game accessibility guidelines, there's Microsoft guidelines and things like that, that kind of provide you with instructions on how you might go about making an accessible game or making your game more accessible. And also there's the development of various physical accessibility tools, like I mentioned, the controllers and things like that just a moment ago. And these are all extremely valuable approaches for designing accessible games and kind of solving some of these problems. However, they don't really tell us much about the experiences of players or developers. I mean, obviously they're not focused on that, but that's still an area of interest. Understanding how players are experiencing games and understanding the challenges that game developers might be experiencing in making them are 2 areas of interest that these kind of approaches don't cover. So, in line with that, a smaller but equally valuable body of literature has focused on understanding how people with disabilities are engaging with the medium. one of my supervisors, Jen Beeston, conducted a study in 2018 and found that people with disabilities are playing mainstream games and use a wide array of different accessibility features. And I think, if I remember correctly, many of these people are also identifying gaming to be their primary hobby as well. So these people are kind of playing the same games that we are, and that they are, they're viewing them in the same way that people do generally. So that means, obviously, it's important that they're accessible in this space as well. However, to our knowledge, there's been little or no investigations of the natural play experience, and there have been no investigations via diary methods into the experiences of people with disabilities. So my previous research also ties in with this a little bit. So my first study as part of my thesis was looking at game developers and their experiences and barriers that they experience towards making accessible games. And what I found there, it's detailed, it has a lot more detail of this in the paper and in the original talk, but the kind of overview of what I found there was really that there were three kind of key areas which were essential to kind of all come together to make accessible games. One thing I found that developers themselves were very motivated towards making accessible games, but lacked knowledge on the lived experiences of disabilities and therefore struggled with that. The organizations that these developers worked within had a capacity to kind of provide a lot of assistance with accessibility, but the buy-in from this organization was critical. So things like, having someone with the responsibility for accessibility work, things like organizing playtests and things like that. It was required for the organization to buy into this idea of making accessible games, to make these things happen, to have this knowledge kind of trickle back down to developers. And as well as that, external resources were considered to be widely available. So developers knew of lots of things like game accessibility guidelines. They also knew that they could get feedback from people with disabilities playing their games and things like that, and these were valued. But again, this ties into this organizational buy-in being critical, because there is this body of knowledge that's available and developers are aware that it's there, but without it being incorporated at an organizational level, it's not necessarily kind of getting to developers. And depending on the organization, issues in one of these kind of three areas, like developer knowledge, organizational buy-in, and the kind of leveraging of external resources, would lead to the kind of presence or absence of accessibility features. And I think what's interesting here is that this idea of a lack of lived experience for game developers is something that we can potentially solve through better understanding the experiences of people with disabilities. So kind of speaking to players with disabilities about their experiences and looking at how that knowledge can be fed down to game developers. So ultimately, I think there's lots of valuable things happening in the industry regarding game accessibility. But in the industry, developer knowledge still tends to be quite limited at times, and there's a lack of kind of knowledge on lived experiences of people with disabilities playing games. In academia, natural player experiences of people with disabilities has seen fairly limited attention. There is some good research in this area, but there's still a lot of potential avenues to do something more. So from that, I kind of came up with a number of kind of key research questions. So the leading one really is, what are the natural play experiences of people with disabilities? And with that comes a number of kind of sub questions as well. So what motivates players to continue to play or to cease play? What are the difficulties and frustrations they experience during natural play? How do players react when encountering accessibility issues? And how do these reactions affect ongoing play? So really interested in understanding how people are playing naturally, but also when they encounter accessibility issues, what's happening there? Like, why is it the case that some people seem to be kind of continuing, or is it the case that all people seem to be quitting when they encounter accessibility issues? And are these really different from other types of issues that they're experiencing in their play experience as well? So just to kind of move on and talk to you about my approach to this research. So I'll start off with kind of saying why diary methods. I spoke about this idea of kind of natural investigation or natural play experience a few times. And I think the kind of best way to put this across was from one of my participants, where they talked about how they loved participating in this kind of study where they're testing a game in their natural play experience and their natural environment where they were most comfortable. So that's what I really want to get at, like the idea of inviting someone to do this kind of separate playtest in a lab or something like that, in a separate environment. There's a lot of unnatural elements to that, and that may cause a lot of unnatural behavior as well. Like if you don't have, I had a player, for instance, that would play games from their bed most of the time because of their disability. They would mainly play from their bed in a particular position, and that's something that just wouldn't be possible for them outside of that kind of natural play experience that took place in their home. As well as that, with the diary method, what I wanted to get at was the way that people play games is it's not for an hour in a lab. It's not for an hour long session. It is on and off across like however long a period of play for a particular game is. In this particular case, we were using a game called Gears of War Tactics, so it wasn't like an endless live service, but it was a game that people could still spend like quite a bit of time on, maybe a month or so. And as I say, part of that is kind of getting at this potentially observing phenomena that may not occur in kind of regular formative playtesting. So part of that as well, for the recruitment criteria, I required that participants had a organic interest in playing Gears of War Tactics, because I thought that was important as well. A lot of the time, when you're running a study on your game, you're taking people from maybe your target audience potentially, but they've not necessarily said that they want to play that game. So what I wanted to get from my players was a group of people who were already interested in playing this game and would potentially play it naturally anyway, so as to capture their kind of player experience. Because I think this is really critical when looking at things like why players are quitting. I need to make sure they actually wanted to play it originally. It needs to be a game that they wanted to kind of had the motivation to engage with in the first place. So I was looking at people who were interested in playing Gears of War Tactics. So most of my players had an interest in the Gears of War franchise, and they had an interest in playing strategy games as well. I also recruited people based on the fact that they were experiencing some degree of disability in games that they played in general. And as well as that, I did also recruit 2 people without disabilities, just as a sort of like comparison to see whether their experiences were radically different with the game or anything like that. Players were all 18 and above. That is because it's better for the kind of ethics side of things and providing informed consent, but also in this particular case, because it is a game with violent content and the game is rated for 18 and above, then it just makes sense to have people aged 18 and above in the study. Why Gears of War Tactics? And I suppose kind of what is Gears of War Tactics as well. So Gears of War Tactics is a turn-based strategy game. And the motivation for using it really was that we wanted to study a game that was kind of in the mainstream popular discourse of what video games were at the time. And Gears of War Tactics is tied to a big franchise. It's a popular game with many millions of players that have engaged with it in some degree. So in that sense, the kind of experiences here are valid in a wider sense, that they are the types of experiences that people are likely to have with a big popular mainstream game. Why specifically Gears of War Tactics rather than kind of Call of Duty or anything like that? And that was really just because I was already in conversation with a member of the team at the studio, Splash Damage, and I was saying, hey, I want to run a study investigating the natural player experiences. Would you be interested in kind of collaborating on that to kind of feed some insight back into your studio as well? So it was just an avenue both to kind of provide some insight for the academic perspective, kind of like understanding broadly the experiences of people with disabilities playing games in these natural environments. Also on a more granular level, I could, at certain points in the process, feed insight back into the studio as well. So, and they had this motivation to improve the accessibility work they were doing for their future titles that kind of drove that. Yeah. So, very briefly, so the recruitment was handled through Able Gamers. Participants provided informed consent. There were 8 participants with disabilities, 2 without. They played the game for the first session, followed by an initial interview about their experience. Then they were left to play 1 month. Well, left to play for 1 month in total, but at the 2-week mark, I interviewed them again. During this period of play, they also completed diary entries at the end of each session that they played. So with that, I was kind of able to keep track of like how frequently people were playing, and also they were able to kind of give me insight on whether maybe they encountered an accessibility barrier. So I could say, oh, what was it that happened there? Can you talk to me about it in more detail when it came to the interview? Because the interview was 2 weeks apart, so it was easier to kind of capture something and then use that to recall things in the interview rather than expect the participant to remember everything that happened from one session to the other. So yeah, so the diary studies were useful, but they really fed into the interviews. And there were a total of 3 interviews, and the study lasted for 1 month in total. The interviews were focused on the player experience surrounding Gears Tactics. A lot of the focus was on accessibility and usability issues, but also their overall experience with the game. Things like whether the players were enjoying the game, how they found the difficulty, what their experience was of the story, and so forth. Really everything that was kind of happening around the game and what was kind of keeping them playing it or making them want to quit in some cases. Participants were also told, because obviously this was like a natural investigation of their player experience, they were told from the very start that if they didn't want to play it anymore, I wanted them to stop playing it. And that was because if they did reach a point in the study where they didn't want to play anymore, I really wanted to capture that and find out why that was and investigate that properly. So I didn't want to encourage people to keep playing when it was unnatural for them to do so. And we did have, I think it was 3 players in total that quit for different reasons, which I'll discuss in some detail in the results section. And the interviews were transcribed in accordance to transcribed and analyzed using reflective thematic analysis, according to Brown and Clark. And the idea of that really is identifying these themes that are kind of things that are happening that usefully explain the experience consistently across participants. So a theme is the idea that it is kind of like a grouping of data that explains something that's happening within the collective experiences of participants. This is a reflexive process as well, so it acknowledges the kind of researcher as the research process as kind of like a co-construction of meaning between participants and the researcher. If you want to read more on that, there will be a kind of, hopefully this will be published soon and you'll be able to read that in more detail, but I can always send you something as well if you reach out to me. Results. So as a result of that kind of thematic analysis, we end up with this sort of thematic map, which details all of our themes a little bit. First was this idea that players wanted to be comfortable. Second was this idea that players wanted to be enabled. Third was this idea that players wanted to find an appropriate challenge through the game. I know I'm going through these quite quickly, but I'll go in a lot more detail in just a moment. Fourth was the idea that players wanted to be entertained by the game and wanted to kind of be entertained by aspects of the design that they appreciated. So in this case, it tended to be the more strategy elements of the game. And then there was this idea that if these kind of desires were dissatisfied, it led to this process of kind of realignment and tolerance. Or if neither of those could be fulfilled, they ended up ceasing play altogether. And so just to talk about these kind of themes in a bit more detail, the first theme was kind of comfort and this desire to be comfortable. And this came through both at the start of the interviews when players talked about kind of how they got set up to play, but also throughout the interviews when they were kind of talking about why they made changes to their game and kind of why they used certain accessibility features and kind of why they made certain adjustments and adaptations and things like that as well. It related back to this idea of comfort. And in some cases, it would be a trade-off of comfort as well, that they weren't altogether happy with, but it was a compromise that they sought just to continue playing. The second idea was this idea of enablement, and this is this idea that players want to be able to understand and enact in the game. So they want to be able to understand what's going on, they want to understand what they need to do in the game, and they want to be able to perform the action that they seek to do when they try and do it, essentially. And this came through in the interviews where players were often, I guess, unhappy when they didn't understand parts of the experience. They were unhappy, confused, or frustrated when they didn't understand aspects of the experience, or they weren't able to do the thing they wanted to do at that particular time. And this didn't necessarily relate to kind of challenge or not being able to kind of succeed in a moment that was intended to be difficult, but it tended to relate to just being able to do things with the interaction design and things like that, like in Gears of War Tactics, to be able to, throw a grenade successfully, or be able to go in cover when they wanted to, or to be able to understand how the cover system works, things like that. People wanted to be enabled. They wanted to be able to understand what they needed to do and what they could do in the game and be able to do it, essentially. And players also wanted to be appropriately challenged. And I talk about the idea of appropriate here And that is because it's not that players wanted to be highly challenged or experience a low degree of challenge. It depends on different factors. And the two of the sub themes here were this idea of it being aligned with their ability. So that's this idea of like, most often it's, they want a moderate degree of challenge. Like players don't want it to be too easy and they don't want it to be too hard. And this goes back to this idea of kind of flow and things like that as well, where academics have suggested before that players want to be in this kind of perfect position between, well, if the game is too easy or the experience is too easy, then they'll be bored. If it's too difficult, then it puts too much pressure and they'll be stressed. And it seems that for most players in my study in particular, they want that kind of moderate degree of challenge that tests their ability to some extent but doesn't go too far. However, also there was this idea of being aligned with mood, and that really just came from a few players that said they weren't really thinking about challenge so much, and in fact they were willing to compromise the idea of the game being appropriately challenging on the basis that they played games to relax and they played games to chill out basically. And in that case, they wanted a low degree of challenge because it was more comfortable then based on their mood as well. And that's something that I think has come through from other researchers in my department as well, who are doing like mood related in game studies, that some people play games not always to be challenged, but just to relax and zone out sometimes and things like that as well. And then finally, we have this idea of kind of entertainment and this idea that players want to be entertained by elements of the game's design. And this really, in a game like Gears of War Tactics, it comes down to kind of, we've labeled this sub-theme, appreciating connection, but what that comes down to is kind of appreciating the story and the characters and being excited to see what happens next and feeling connected to the narrative and kind of the characters in the game and their outcomes. And secondly, this idea of kind of planning and uncertainty. And Gears of War Tactics is a strategy game. And what do you do in the strategy game? You strategize, and an integral component of strategy is uncertainty. Like, you don't plan for inevitabilities. You don't plan for a linear sequence of events which will, in absolute terms, happen the way you suppose it does. So it makes sense very naturally that this idea of like uncertainty and planning comes up as kind of two areas of the game that players appreciate here. I expect this idea of entertainment would be the area that really varies depending on the kind of game that you were using as the kind of artifact for your analysis. But yeah, that's essentially the key themes there. And the idea of these key themes in particular is they are desires that players had, essentially. So these are kind of areas that players were seeking from the experience. And when those desires were dissatisfied, that's when we start talking about this kind of process of realignment and tolerance. So when players don't feel enabled, when they don't feel comfortable, when they don't feel appropriately challenged, that's when they start to think, oh, well, I'm not having the kind of experience I want from this game. What accommodations are there? What adaptations can I make? And players tend to start with accommodations. So they start to, and by accommodations, I mean they look in the game for features that will accommodate the experience that they are after. So that means, accessibility features like going into the options menu and changing things and things like that as well. And second, this idea of adaptation. So that was when players didn't feel that there was an appropriate accommodation, they sought means to kind of change the experience in themselves. And they had different strategies for doing this. One of them would be kind of making a physical change, like one player sat closer to the screen. One player didn't find the text-to-speech feature useful, so they turned it off and then sat closer to the screen. So they sought an accommodation. The accommodation didn't work, so they've made an adaptation instead and sat closer to the screen. But in that process, they also talked about how it compromised comfort as well. So there's a degree of like tolerance there as well, kind of like desire to keep playing despite a slightly compromised experience. And then moving on from that, when that process when they weren't able to realign the experience, it doesn't mean players necessarily would quit playing. That's when they start to think about kind of what they were willing to tolerate. And one of the big things here was kind of advocacy. And this is an element of the study which I suppose is a little bit unnatural, is that players don't normally talk to someone about their player experience when they play a game. So players were talking about the value of being advocates for people with disabilities and themselves. And then also people were talking about kind of, well, I don't feel enabled in this way maybe, or I don't feel I understand this particular system, but I do really like the story, or I do really like the strategy in the game, or some other element of the game, or I do find the challenge enjoyable, or something like that. And then that would be a reason to kind of tolerate these other issues. However, if something, if it couldn't be realigned, so they couldn't find adaptations, and they couldn't tolerate it, then that tends to be where they would stop playing. So, and that could be in some cases accessibility issues, but it could also be, the difficulty in the game was found to be too challenging, or it could be, and that obviously those two might be tied together, but they might not be in some cases. Like one of my players found the difficulty quite high, even though it wasn't necessarily tied to a particular accessibility issue or anything like that. Or it could be that they didn't appreciate certain elements of the game. One of my players found the strategy elements too repetitive, and therefore they found that they weren't satisfied by the kind of like idea of planning and strategy, because they felt that they could deploy the same strategy every time. So there wasn't really any planning and strategy then, because they were doing the same thing, and therefore that was also a reason for them to kind of want to stop playing. Conclusions. So, people with disabilities have similar motivations and seek similar experiences, such as enjoying narrative and strategy, to what you would expect people to have when designing a game. People with disabilities often want ability-appropriate challenge, but players can also seek challenge based on their mood. Accessibility issues and usability issues are very similarly experienced. They both provide these kind of barriers to enablement, but accessibility issues are a larger mismatch that more commonly occurs because the game is less commonly accommodating. So they're a mismatch that occurs due to a specific interaction with that player's abilities, and they tend to be larger because the games are less commonly designed for them and less commonly feature accommodations for them as well. People make significant efforts to adapt where possible, but without accommodations, the experience becomes compromised and sometimes unplayable. So I talked about that experience about one player who made their own adaptations, but it compromised their comfort in some way, and they still had to tolerate certain elements of the game that weren't really properly aligned with what they wanted from the experience. And also, I guess, finally, people with disabilities are often strong advocates for themselves and people with similar experiences. They offer valuable insight and want to contribute towards making inclusive games. So the implications of this really are, as usability and accessibility issues are kind of manifesting in a similar way, then it really highlights the benefit to incorporate all this flexibility into the way that games are designed, as it's a means of making them more inclusive for everyone. Accessibility settings don't just benefit people with a particular access need, but anyone that might experience any sort of usability issue around that too. And I think that's something that we see with the way people use them as well. I think there's lots of data out there that suggests people use the features that maybe were traditionally designed for accessibility, but benefit the experience overall too. People are quite varied and complex in their motivations for seeking difficulty. And again, flexibility is the key component there. You can't anticipate exactly why people will go into your game wanting to play it. And it makes sense, in my opinion, to be as flexible as possible to accommodate those people. If someone feels they are in a position where they have quite a low mood and want to relax, or they had a stressful day at work or something like that, and they want to relax and play a game, then that seems to me like a very valid way to seek an experience from it that is of low difficulty in some cases too. So that's one of the avenues why it's valuable to include difficulty options. There are many others as well. Accessibility by design and accessible accessibility options help avoid players entering that process of realignment altogether. So we talked about the kind of when these desires were not fulfilled, then they enter this process of realignment. If the game is actually accessible by default, or it is quite upfront with the kind of accessibility features it has, and players can accommodate themselves out of the gate, then players don't even have to enter that process of tolerance. They don't have to stop and disengage and think, oh, like, how can I realign my experience in a way that fulfills my needs? They can just play the game and experience the game. So that highlights the value of, not only the inclusion of accessibility features, but the accessibility of them. Things like having front-loaded accessibility settings, and also designing for accessibility at the core as well. So, and the other part of it is that many people with disabilities want to be included in the process of making games. So there's a valuable and sometimes untapped insight available there. Just in case your studio isn't kind of gathering insight from people with disabilities, that it's important to be aware that that is available. There are lots of people out there who want to kind of be consultants and offer their insight on their experiences towards making your game more inclusive and accessible. And there is also a lot of value in retrospective analysis. A lot of developers appear to be moving forward all the time. And historically, we've not made a lot of accessible games. Like if you look at kind of like, I don't know, PlayStation 3 era, then it was very uncommon for games to be accessible. And even many titles on like the PlayStation 4 kind of generation and things like that, it was very common for games to ship without any major accessibility features. So I think it's important when moving forward, and if you have this idea, okay, our next game is going to be more accessible, then it can be a really important first step to say, well, actually, how accessible was our last game, and what can we learn from that before we move forward? So I think there's a lot of value in that kind of style of retrospective analysis as well. Brilliant. That's the end of my talk. If you have any questions or anything like that, I will be present physically at GAConf in London. So if you're here, then I should be here as well, and you can come up to me and ask me anything about my research or anything like that. My email, if you want to contact me virtually, is joe.kulik@york.ac.uk, and my LinkedIn, it should be under Joseph Kulik, so you should just be able to search that and you should be able to find me. I'm also finishing my PhD in September. Afterwards, I'll be looking for kind of game accessibility related roles in the industry, or games user research related roles as well. So feel free to contact me about anything like that too. Thanks so much for listening. Bye.